That's right. I mean, this fear is not just about getting foot and mouth disease transmitted to Australia, but it's also about cattle that come to Indonesia. So Indonesia is in fact the largest live export market for Australia. In a good year, it's worth about $500 million a year, and something like 300,000 head of cattle, maybe more, are sent to feedlots throughout Indonesia, particularly in Java and Sumatra. Now, these feedlots, they have been hammered during the pandemic. They've already lost a lot of business as people have lost their jobs, families have lost their income, they haven't been getting enough work, so they can't afford to eat meat as much as they used to. So that has already caused a lot of harm to the industry. Now they're dealing with foot and mouth disease, which has spread very rapidly through Sumatra and Java particularly. And some feedlots, we're told, they've had a drop in demand for live cattle by at least 50%. Some have stopped importing cattle altogether. There's a fear that even if one head of cattle comes in that's infected, that will infect the rest of the herd. They will lose their business because they'll have to shut the feedlot altogether. And I'm told that consumers too are fearful of eating contaminated meat. Some Indonesians are fearful of catching foot and mouth disease themselves, even though we know that possibility is exceedingly rare and it's very unlikely to happen. It's not beyond the realms of possibility. So those have all fed into a drop in demand from Australia. Some, as I say, some feedlots have stopped importing altogether. So what was once a very lucrative industry for Australia has severely plummeted. Although I spoke to the Live Export Council in Australia, and they're not as downbeat, if you like, as the Indonesians. They say that the market typically goes through ups and downs. Australia did lose quite a lot of cattle from the drought, even through floods, and that raised the price of cattle. There's still strong demand from other markets like India and so on, and that means that there is somewhere for a lot of these cattle to go. But certainly any loss of export income is bad news for Australia. They just have to wait this out. They're looking at it as a postponement or a delay rather than a loss of exports. So the key now is vaccination. Once we see feedlots vaccinate their cattle and there's less chance of spreading foot and mouth disease, then they can resume those imports from Australia and the market will return to what it once was. The only problem there is that we're told that feedlots, in fact, are the lowest priority. It's small farms in Indonesia that have higher priority for vaccinations. And even though Australia, for example, has offered to pay for 1 million vaccines into Indonesia, they will go to smaller farms before they go to feedlots. So it could be weeks, if not months, before the import industry into Indonesia for live cattle returns to what it was.
And the biggest risk for Australia is the tourist movement in and out of Bali. But after initial concerns a few weeks ago, it looks like the disease isn't getting too out of control there.
That's right. I mean, there is a big risk in Bali simply because of the sheer numbers of Australians who go there as tourists and the fact that so many cattle in Bali are found in areas where tourists also go about their daily lives. There are so many families who own typically 1 or 2 cows, and some of those cows, of course, are infected. But when you look at the numbers of cattle that are affected, it's only like 554 head of cattle so far in Bali that have got foot and mouth disease out of a herd of about 600,000 in Bali. Vaccinations in Bali are going up very strongly, not super fast, but steadily, if you like, so that it may well be that they can vaccinate that herd and reach a high level of immunity in time to stop the disease spreading in a way that tourists will bring it back from Bali to Australia. But of course, the real risk is perhaps in Java and Sumatra, where I said that's where the foot and mouth disease really has a strong establishment, if you like. There are hundreds of thousands of cattle that have been, they've been vaccinated already, but thousands that have been, made sick, thousands also that have died. It's very bad in East Java. And so any Australians that come back from Indonesia, anywhere really, have still got that risk of bringing foot and mouth disease back to Australia.
Meanwhile, Indonesian President Joko Widodo is making a visit to China. What's the significance of this visit? Why is he there?
Well, interestingly, he's the first foreign leader to go to China since the Winter Olympics back in January, February of this year. He's gone at the invitation of Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader. He's meeting today with him and also the Premier Li Keqiang. Now, trade is very much on the agenda. They're actually both very strong markets for each other. There's a very strong and healthy trade relationship. China is a very major investor in Indonesia. For example, it has a very large Belt and Roads program in Indonesia. It's building a very fast train between Jakarta and Bandung, for example. And certainly that will be the main agenda, if you like, both in China and also when Joko Widodo, the president, visits Japan and South Korea in coming days. But there is another agenda item, and that is the G20 Leaders Summit that Indonesia is hosting this year in November in Bali. And some leaders are yet to confirm that they'll go. There's an expectation that President Jokowi will offer or renew that invitation for Xi Jinping to go to Bali. And it's come at a very sensitive time, obviously, when there's a lot of questions about China's relationship with Russia, during the Ukraine war, and also China's growing assertiveness in the Pacific and in the South China Sea. So there are reasons why there's a bit of sensitivity about whether China will or will not be present at the G20, in the same way that we're still to hear for sure whether President Putin from Russia will be there in person or perhaps online. So we may hear more in the next 24 hours whether that invitation has been given and whether in fact it has been accepted.
And thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne.